The interview that nobody saw coming. Nobody at Steelers training camp expected the biggest headline of the day to have almost nothing to do with football. Fans gathered under the Pennsylvania summer sky, waving terrible towels and cheering as Aaron Rodgers walked onto the set of the Pat McAfee Show. The atmosphere felt like the beginning of a farewell celebration for one of the NFL's most polarizing quarterbacks. Everyone expected stories about his final season, his legacy, and one last run toward a championship. Instead, within moments, the conversation took a stunning turn that would dominate sports headlines across America. Pat McAfee opened with what seemed like the safest question imaginable, asking Rodgers how he viewed the final chapter of his NFL career. It was the kind of question every veteran quarterback gets. Calm, respectful, predictable. Rodgers smiled. Then everything changed. Rather than giving a heartfelt answer about retirement, Rodgers made an unexpected reference to Dr. Anthony Fauci and quickly shifted into a series of sharp criticisms tied to recent public events and media coverage. What began as a routine football interview suddenly transformed into one of the most controversial live television moments of the NFL offseason. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Some laughed, others looked stunned. Even people on the set appeared caught off guard as the discussion drifted further away from football and deeper into topics that few expected to hear during a Steelers training camp broadcast. Within minutes, clips from the interview spread across social media, sports shows, news outlets, and fans rushed to debate what Rodgers had said, why he chose that moment, and whether his comments would overshadow what he has repeatedly described as his final NFL season. But this wasn't simply another headline involving Aaron Rodgers. For many viewers, it felt like years of frustration, controversy, and unfinished battles had suddenly resurfaced on live television. The biggest question was no longer how Rodgers would perform this season. It was whether this unforgettable interview would become the defining story of his farewell tour before the first meaningful snap had even been played. Before we dive into what Rodgers actually said and why the reaction exploded across the sports world, we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city, state, or country in the comments. If you think this story is bigger than just football, comment un. If you think it's being blown out of proportion, comment deux. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the biggest NFL stories and behind-the-scenes drama. One harmless question changed everything. Pat McAfee had handed Aaron Rodgers the easiest opening possible. There was no trap, no accusation, and no attempt to drag him into controversy. McAfee simply wanted to know how a four-time MVP approached what Rodgers had described as the final season of his NFL career. For almost any veteran quarterback, the answer would have written itself. Gratitude, unfinished business, teammates, family, and one final shot at a championship. But Rodgers did not give the expected answer. Instead, he used the moment to reference Dr. Anthony Fauci, turning a retirement question into a sharp political and cultural statement. The shift happened so quickly that the crowd initially treated it like a joke. Laughter rolled across the set. But the mood changed when Rodgers kept going. What sounded like a throwaway line became a sustained attack. And every additional sentence pushed the interview farther away from football. That escalation was what made the moment so powerful. Rodgers was not reacting to a hostile interviewer. He was choosing the battlefield himself. He had been given a warm stage, a supportive crowd, and a question designed to celebrate his career. Yet he used that comfort to reopen one of the most divisive chapters of his public life. The people sitting beside him could only react in real time. McAfee smiled. The panelists laughed nervously, and the crowd tried to decide whether it was witnessing comedy, confession, or confrontation. There was no prepared segment package, no controlled debate, and no clear way to steer Rodgers back without making the situation even more awkward. That is when the interview stopped feeling like a farewell tour appearance. It began to feel like Rodgers had arrived with years of unresolved frustration and had finally found the perfect microphone to release it. What made the moment even more dangerous was the setting. This was not a private conversation or a loosely edited podcast. Cameras were rolling live from Steelers training camp, with fans standing only a few feet away and ESPN carrying every word. Rodgers understood exactly where he was. He also understood that once the comments left his mouth, they could not be taken back, and he was only getting started. Rodgers turns the spotlight on Fauci. Rodgers' criticism centered on recent testimony involving Dr. Anthony Fauci, But the quarterback's anger clearly reached far beyond one hearing. He referred to Fauci's decision to invoke constitutional protections while answering questions and questioned why a former public health official would decline to respond so many times. Rodgers framed the situation as a contradiction between public authority and private caution. Those were Rodgers' claims and interpretations, not settled conclusions. But on live television, he delivered them with the confidence of someone who believed the argument had already been won. That confidence was the engine of the entire rant. Rodgers did not sound uncertain, defensive, or worried about backlash. He sounded vindicated. In his version of events, the recent hearing represented proof that the people who had criticized him years earlier were now facing questions of their own. The quarterback appeared to see the moment not as a new controversy, but as an opportunity to settle an old score. The intensity grew as he repeatedly challenged Fauci's public image and questioned the media's treatment of the story. Rodgers suggested that networks had spent endless hours dissecting his vaccine status, his language, and his personal decisions, while giving far less attention to testimony involving one of the most recognizable figures from the pandemic era. Whether viewers agreed with him or rejected his argument, the emotional logic was easy to understand. Rodgers believed the spotlight had once been aimed mercilessly at him. Now he wanted that same spotlight turned in the opposite direction. But the language he used made the situation even more explosive. He moved from criticism of decisions to personal condemnation, using labels that transformed the conversation from policy disagreement into accusation. Some remarks referenced claims that were unverified, and that distinction mattered. Every sharper statement increased the legal, ethical, and reputational pressure surrounding the broadcast. The atmosphere on the set reflected that growing danger. The crowd still reacted, but the laughter became less comfortable. The panelists appeared increasingly aware that the interview had crossed into territory no one had planned to enter. Rodgers, however, showed no sign of slowing down, because in his mind, Fauci was only one part of the story. The larger target was the institution Rodgers believed had spent years defining him, and that institution was sitting directly across from him. ESPN becomes the next target. Criticizing a former government official was controversial enough. Criticizing ESPN while appearing live on ESPN created an entirely different level of tension. Rodgers began questioning the network's priorities, asking why certain controversies received non-stop coverage while others barely appeared on television. His point was not subtle. He believed sports media had treated his personal choices as a national scandal, but had shown far less energy when covering stories that could embarrass powerful people inside the industry. The irony became impossible to ignore. Rodgers was standing on a stage carrying ESPN's branding, sitting beside a host whose show aired through the network, while accusing that same organization of lacking courage and consistency. Every camera capturing the attack belonged to the company being attacked. Every microphone amplifying his criticism was connected to the platform he was questioning. McAfee suddenly found himself in the most uncomfortable position on the set. He had built his show around unpredictability and authenticity, and Rodgers had long been one of its most important recurring guests. Cutting him off would have contradicted the program's identity. Allowing him to continue risked turning the show into a public indictment of its own corporate partner. So McAfee let the conversation breathe. That decision made the moment feel even more dangerous. Rodgers appeared to realize that nobody was going to stop him, and the absence of resistance became permission to push harder. Panelists attempted to redirect the discussion, but every detour seemed to lead back toward media accountability. The quarterback questioned how networks decide which stories deserve attention and which stories quietly disappear. He contrasted the relentless examination of his past with what he described as silence surrounding controversies involving media insiders. The more he spoke, the less this sounded like a spontaneous tangent. It sounded like an argument he had been preparing for years. Rodgers had always maintained a complicated relationship with the press. He understood its power, benefited from its attention, and frequently accused it of distortion. On this day, those tensions finally collided in full public view. The real shock was not simply that Rodgers criticized ESPN, it was that he did so on ESPN. During a celebration of his final season, with the network unable or unwilling to take back control, and then Rodgers introduced a second controversy that made the stakes even more personal. The old wound from 2021 reopens. To understand why Rodgers sounded so angry, the story had to return to 2021. That was when his vaccination status became one of the most debated issues in American sports. Months earlier, Rodgers had told reporters he was immunized. Many listeners assumed that meant he had received an approved COVID 19 vaccine. When he later tested positive and missed a game, the public learned that his use of the word carried a different meaning. The reaction was immediate. Critics accused him of misleading reporters and fans. Supporters argued that his medical decisions were private. Television panels debated his honesty, his responsibility as a team leader, and the example he was setting. For days, Rodgers was discussed not as a quarterback, but as a symbol in a much larger cultural battle. That experience changed him. Rodgers later explained his health concerns, discussed treatments he had pursued, and pushed back against the way journalists characterized his decisions. Medical experts disputed several of the claims surrounding those treatments, while Rodgers insisted that the conversation had been oversimplified and weaponized against him. The controversy never truly ended. It followed him through his final years in Green Bay, through the move to the New York Jets, through injury, and eventually into Pittsburgh. Every new interview carried the possibility that the old argument would return. By the time he sat beside McAfee at Steelers camp, Rodgers no longer appeared interested in avoiding the subject. He seemed determined to rewrite the meaning of it. In his mind, 2021 had been a public trial conducted by people who never intended to listen. He believed former friends had turned against him, networks had mocked him, and commentators had reduced a complicated personal decision to a single label. That grievance became part of his identity. Now, with Fauci facing renewed public questioning, Rodgers appeared to believe history had shifted in his favor. But that belief created a contradiction he could not escape. Every time Rodgers demanded accountability from others, critics returned to the ambiguity of immunized. Every time he claimed vindication, they reminded audiences of statements that medical authorities had challenged. The past had not disappeared. It was sitting beside him during the interview, shaping every word and ensuring that his farewell season would never be only about football. Why Rodgers believes he was vindicated. Rodgers' body language told its own story. He was not speaking like a man worried about punishment. He was speaking like a man taking a victory lap. He repeatedly challenged his critics to find a new reason to attack him. The message was clear. The old narratives, in his view, had collapsed. He believed later reporting, public hearings, and changing conversations about the pandemic had validated at least part of what he had argued years earlier. That belief explains why the interview became so intense. Rodgers did not appear to see himself as restarting an unnecessary fight. He appeared to see himself as finally answering people who had spent years defining him without consequences. The broadcast became his opportunity to reverse the roles. This time, he was asking the questions. This time, ESPN was uncomfortable. This time, the people who once analyzed his every sentence were being asked to defend their own choices. Supporters immediately embraced that interpretation. Clips spread online with captions celebrating Rodgers for speaking without fear. Some fans praised him for confronting institutions they already distrusted. To them, his comments represented authenticity in an era of carefully managed interviews and corporate messaging. Critics saw something completely different. They argued that Rodgers was confusing uncertainty with proof and using unresolved questions to declare total victory. They pointed out that public health decisions, scientific dispute, and government investigations cannot be reduced to one viral television moment. They also questioned whether a football interview was the appropriate setting for accusations involving complex medical and political issues. Both reactions strengthened Rodgers' celebrity. For supporters, he became a truth-teller, refusing to surrender. For critics, he remained a reckless star who treated confidence as evidence. The deeper the division became, the more attention the clip received. That may have been part of Rodgers' strategy. Even if it was not fully planned, he has always understood that controversy gives him control of the conversation. As long as everyone is debating what he said, they are operating inside a story he created. But control has a cost. The interview gave Rodgers the emotional release he wanted, yet it also guaranteed that questions about his final season would be filtered through the same old conflict. Every touchdown, every loss, every press conference, and every television appearance could now become another referendum on his worldview. Rodgers may have felt vindicated, but vindication and closure are not the same thing, and the next target he named ensured that the controversy would grow even larger. The Rossini-Vrabel controversy enters the story. Rodgers then shifted toward a separate controversy involving NFL reporter Diana Rossini and coach Mike Vrabel. The story had already attracted online attention because of photographs and speculation surrounding their personal relationship. Both individuals reportedly denied the broader implications suggested by the images, and many details remain disputed or unverified. Rodgers focused on something different: media coverage and professional influence. He questioned why ESPN had not examined the situation with the same intensity it once applied to him. Rossini had previously worked at ESPN, and Rodgers appeared to suggest that institutional relationships may have affected the network's willingness to discuss the controversy. Then he raised the stakes. Rodgers pointed to questions surrounding NFL award voting and whether a personal relationship could create a potential conflict of interest. He did not establish that voting had been compromised. Instead, he posed the possibility publicly and left viewers to consider it. That distinction was crucial, but it did little to reduce the drama. A private life controversy had suddenly been connected to the credibility of league honors, media ethics, and the integrity of NFL journalism. Rodgers was no longer simply complaining about unfair headlines. He was suggesting that powerful institutions might protect insiders while aggressively scrutinizing players. For ESPN, this was more dangerous than the Fauci discussion. The network could distance itself from a political controversy. It was far harder to ignore a direct challenge involving a former employee, NFL coverage, and accusations of selective silence. McAfee and the panel appeared increasingly uncomfortable as Rodgers continued. Attempts to move the conversation forward only reinforced the impression that certain subjects were too sensitive to explore. That visual reaction became part of the story. Viewers were not only listening to Rodgers, they were studying the faces around him online. The clip spread quickly. Some fans argued that Rodgers had exposed a double standard. Others accused him of repeating personal speculation without sufficient evidence. Media commentators debated whether he had raised a legitimate ethical question or irresponsibly amplified gossip. That uncertainty made the segment impossible to dismiss. Rodgers had planted a question that no easy statement could fully erase, even without proving wrongdoing. He had forced audiences to examine how sports media covers its own industry, and once that question reached millions of viewers, the reaction split the NFL world almost perfectly in half. Fans divide into two different camps. The online reaction was immediate, emotional, and deeply divided. One group celebrated Rodgers as fearless. They praised him for attacking media hypocrisy and saying what they believed other athletes were too cautious to say. To these fans, the quarterback had transformed a predictable television appearance into a rare moment of honesty. They viewed the discomfort on the ESPN set as evidence that Rodgers had touched a sensitive nerve. Another group saw the interview as irresponsible. They argued that Rodgers used a football platform to spread inflammatory accusations, reopen health misinformation debates, and involve people whose private lives were already being dissected online. For these viewers, the segment did not represent courage. It represented a star using his influence without enough concern for accuracy or consequences. The disagreement moved far beyond football. Political commentators treated the clip as proof of their existing beliefs. Sports outlets focused on the tension between Rodgers and ESPN. Fans debated whether McAfee should have interrupted him. Others questioned whether the Steelers wanted their training camp transformed into a national argument about media, medicina, and institutional trust. Every side watched the same clip and saw a different story. Supporters saw a man reclaiming his reputation. Critics saw a man unable to let go of old resentment. Some viewers believed ESPN had been exposed. Others believed the network had simply allowed a guest to speak freely. Even McAfee's decision not to cut away became part of the controversy, with some praising his commitment to open conversation and others accusing the show of providing a platform without meaningful challenge. The division guaranteed that the story would last. Controversies disappear when audiences agree they are unimportant. This one survived because millions of people believed it confirmed something larger. It became a debate about who controls information, who receives protection, and whether famous athletes should be treated as truth-tellers, entertainers, or simply citizens with microphones. Rodgers understood the power of that division. Throughout his career, he had often appeared most energized when public opinion split around it. Approval strengthened his confidence. Criticism gave him another opponent, but his final season created a new risk. At 39, 40, or beyond, controversy can no longer be dismissed as part of a young superstar's evolution. Every public moment becomes part of the final judgment on a career, and the question facing Rodgers was becoming unavoidable. Had he defended his legacy, or had he just made it harder to remember anything else? The real cost could hit his final season. The immediate aftermath appeared surprisingly quiet. ESPN did not cut the broadcast. No public fine was announced. No dramatic corporate statement immediately separated the network from Rodgers' comments. The segment ended. The internet spread the clips, and Steelers training camp continued. But silence did not mean there would be no consequences. Rodgers entered Pittsburgh carrying one of the most complicated reputations in modern NFL history. He was a future Hall of Fame quarterback, a four-time MVP, and one of the most gifted passers the league had ever seen. He was also a player whose off-field statements regularly became larger than the games themselves. The Steelers signed him to help win football games. They needed leadership, timing, chemistry, and stability. Instead, before the season had fully begun, the team found itself attached to another national controversy. That distraction could matter. Every upcoming press conference now carried the possibility of follow-up questions about ESPN, Fauci, media BS, or the Rossini-Vrabel controversy. Reporters looking for football answers would have little reason to ignore a story generating millions of views. Teammates could be asked whether they agreed with Rodgers. Coaches could be pressed about whether the comments reflected the organization. Even if Rodgers performed well, the drama could follow him. And if the Steelers struggled, the interview would be re-examined as evidence that his attention had been divided. That is the burden created when a quarterback becomes more than a quarterback. Every loss turns into a character debate. Every disagreement becomes a leadership question. Rodgers may welcome that pressure. He has spent much of his career proving he can operate inside conflict, but a farewell season is different. There are no unlimited opportunities to change the final image. The most important question is no longer whether Rodgers had the right to speak. He clearly did. The question is whether the way he used that freedom helped the message he wanted to deliver or buried it beneath anger, accusation, and spectacle. His supporters will remember a star who refused to remain silent. His critics will remember another unnecessary explosion. The Steelers will care about something simpler, whether Rodgers can still lead an offense when the noise becomes deafening, because in the end, his final NFL chapter will not be judged only by what he said into a microphone. It will be judged by what happens when he finally steps onto the field. The legacy will be written by more than one interview. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, Aaron Rodgers walked away from the set exactly as he had arrived. Still the most fascinating and unpredictable figure in the NFL. But the conversation he left behind had grown far beyond one interview, one television network, or one controversial exchange. It had become another chapter in a career that has always balanced extraordinary football brilliance with an equally extraordinary ability to dominate headlines. Whether viewers agreed with Rodgers or strongly disagreed with him, one reality became impossible to ignore. He once again controlled the national conversation. While other quarterbacks spent training camp discussing playbooks, chemistry, and championship expectations, Rodgers ensured that millions of people were debating something entirely different. That ability to command attention has been one of his greatest strengths throughout his career, but it has also been one of his greatest risks. From a strategic perspective, this moment illustrates an important lesson about leadership in today's media environment. Every public appearance is no longer just an interview. It is a defining moment capable of shaping an athlete's legacy. Every sentence can inspire supporters, energize critics, dominate headlines, and influence how history remembers a career. For superstars with massive platforms, words often travel much farther than touchdowns. Another lesson is equally important. Healthy debate is a natural part of sports, media, and democracy. People will always disagree on public figures, policies, and controversial events. But lasting credibility is built when discussions remain grounded in evidence, respect, and a willingness to let audiences examine multiple perspectives. Passion may capture attention, but thoughtful dialogue earns long-term trust. Rodgers now enters what he has repeatedly described as his final NFL season, carrying enormous expectations. Steelers fans ultimately care about victories, leadership, and whether their veteran quarterback can deliver when the games matter most. No television interview, regardless of how viral it becomes, can replace what happens between the sidelines once the regular season begins. That is why the next few months may determine far more than one controversial headline. They may determine how Aaron Rodgers is remembered decades from now. Will history focus primarily on a Hall of Fame resume filled with MVP trophies, unforgettable playoff performances, and one of the greatest arms the game has ever seen? Or will it remember a player whose willingness to challenge institutions repeatedly overshadowed his accomplishments on the field? Only time can answer that question. For now, one thing is certain. The interview reminded everyone that Aaron Rodgers remains one of the NFL's most compelling personalities. Whether he is throwing touchdown passes or creating headlines with his opinions, He continues to generate conversations that extend well beyond football, and with an entire season still ahead. This story may be far from over. Now we want to hear your opinion. Did Aaron Rodgers simply speak his mind? Or did this interview create an unnecessary distraction heading into his final season? Comment 1 if you believe he was justified, or comment 2 if you think he went too far. Be respectful of other viewpoints. Join the discussion, and let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoyed this breakdown of the biggest NFL stories and behind-the-scenes drama, don't forget to like this video, share it with fellow football fans, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next in-depth report